The Zinter delegation towered over the human envoy, their angular, metallic forms glinting under the sterile lights of the chamber. Their movements were precise, devoid of the inefficiency they claimed riddled the human species. Captain Elias Morgan stood before them, hands clasped behind his back, his calm demeanor masking the simmering frustration he felt under their scrutinizing gaze. He was accustomed to being underestimated, but the overt disdain radiating from these creatures was something new. "You are familiar with Karen IV, Captain?" The Zinter speaker's voice emerged, smooth and calculated, its synthetic undertone betraying no emotion. "I've read the reports," Elias replied, his voice steady. He had spent the last week poring over every scrap of intel he could find on the planet, a jagged wasteland where survival was measured in hours. What the reports lacked in detail, they made up for in grim certainty. No one who had been sent to Karen IV had returned alive. The Zinter leader inclined its narrow head, the gesture almost mocking. "Then you understand the opportunity we present. Your species, untested as it is, has the chance to prove its value in the wider galactic order." Elias resisted the urge to scoff. Opportunity. The Zinter always dressed their contempt in the language of diplomacy. He knew the truth. This wasn't a test. It was a death sentence. The Zinter had long dismissed humanity as a species of brash primitives, and now they intended to cement that belief by sending one of them to certain doom. "And what exactly do you expect me to achieve on Karen IV?" Elias asked, keeping his tone neutral. "Survive," the speaker replied simply. "The Malethrak rules the planet, a predator that has resisted every effort to contain it. We seek a demonstration of your adaptability, your ingenuity. Prove you can stand against it, or die proving you cannot." A low murmur rippled through the human delegation behind Elias, but he didn't flinch. The Zinter's sleek faces revealed nothing, but their postures spoke volumes. They anticipated failure. They wanted it. "What happens if I succeed?" Elias pressed, his gray eyes locking onto the speaker's glinting orbs. A faint hiss of air escaped the Zinter leader, a sound Elias had come to recognize as their version of amusement. "If you succeed, you will have earned your species a place among us. Resources, alliances, knowledge, all within your grasp. But let us not dwell on hypotheticals." The room fell silent, the weight of the challenge settling over the human contingent like a shroud. Elias could feel their unspoken doubts pressing against him. He knew what they were thinking. "Why him? Why take the gamble?" Elias broke the silence. "I accept." The murmur rose again, sharper this time, but he didn't waver. The Zinter speaker tilted its head in approval, or perhaps disbelief. "Then it is decided," the alien said. "Preparations will begin immediately. We will deliver you to Karen IV in 3 standard cycles. May your ingenuity prove worthy." The meeting dissolved in a flurry of movement, but Elias stayed rooted, his mind already racing. He had 3 days to prepare for a mission designed to kill him. 3 days to find an edge against a creature that had bested an entire species. A voice broke his thoughts. "Captain." Elias turned to face Colonel Anders, his direct superior and one of the few people in the room who hadn't protested his decision aloud. Anders was a stocky man with a gruff demeanor, but his eyes held a quiet intensity that Elias respected. "Walk with me," Anders said. They left the chamber, stepping into a narrow corridor lined with observation windows. Outside, the cold void of space stretched endlessly, the scattered pinpricks of distant stars the only reminder of how far from home they were. "Do you have a plan?" Anders asked after a long silence. "I have 3 days to come up with one," Elias replied. Anders nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars. "You know they want you to fail. This isn't about proving humanity's worth. It's about proving we're expendable." "I know," Elias said. "But if there's even a chance to turn this around, I have to take it." Anders stopped, turning to face him. "Just remember, you're not alone in this. We'll give you every tool we've got. Don't let their arrogance fool you into thinking this is a solo fight." Elias offered a faint smile. "I'll keep that in mind." They parted ways, and Elias spent the next 3 days in a whirlwind of preparation. He studied every fragment of data on the Malethrak, its size, its speed, its rumored intelligence. He trained relentlessly, pushing his body to the limits in simulated environments designed to mimic Karen IV's brutal conditions. He worked with engineers to modify his equipment, ensuring every piece of gear he carried had multiple functions. When the time came to board the Zinner transport, he felt as ready as he could be. The Zinner themselves offered no words of encouragement, only cold, efficient instructions. As the ship descended into Karen IV's atmosphere, Elias caught his first glimpse of the planet through the viewport. It was a landscape of jagged cliffs and roiling storms, the air thick with a perpetual haze. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the surface in brief, violent flashes. It was a world that seemed to reject life itself. The Zinner pilot's voice crackled over the comms. "You will be deposited here. Retrieval is contingent on your success." Elias didn't reply. He gripped the edge of his seat as the transport shuddered, the ground rushing up to meet him. With a final lurch, the ship landed, the doors hissing open to reveal the hostile terrain. He stepped out into the gale, the wind immediately clawing at his suit. The transport lifted off behind him, leaving him alone on the desolate expanse. Alone, save for the creature watching from the shadows. Elias took a deep breath, the weight of the challenge pressing down on him. Then he began to move, every step carrying him deeper into the unknown. The air on Karen 4 was heavy, laden with a metallic tang that clung to the back of Elias Morgan's throat despite the filters in his helmet. The storm above roared like a living thing, flashes of violet lightning illuminating the jagged landscape in fleeting bursts. He adjusted the settings on his visor, switching to thermal imaging, but even that seemed to struggle against the planet's oppressive atmosphere. The environment felt alive, hostile in every way, as though the very planet resented his presence. Elias moved cautiously, his boots crunching against the coarse, ash-covered ground. Every step sent faint vibrations through the earth, and he wondered if the male thrak could sense him already. The Zinter reports described it as a creature of unparalleled lethality, a predator that had decimated entire hunting parties with speed and cunning. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't here to die quietly. The first few hours were a careful study in survival. Elias noted the erratic patterns of the storm, using a portable scanner to track wind currents and electrical discharges. He marked potential landmarks on his map. A cluster of jagged spires that resembled teeth, a dry riverbed winding through the cracked earth, and a natural cave formation that could provide temporary shelter. He knew he couldn't stay in one place too long. The male thrak would be hunting, and it would only be a matter of time before it found him. A faint rumble drew his attention, distinct from the ever-present growl of the storm. He froze, his pulse quickening as he scanned the horizon. Nothing. Just the jagged silhouette of the spires in the distance and the shifting haze of the storm. He kept moving, his senses on high alert, every instinct screaming that he was being watched. The first encounter came without warning. One moment, the landscape was still, the only sound the howling wind. The next, a shadow erupted from the ground, a flash of teeth and claws lunging toward him. Elias dove to the side, the creature missing him by inches. He rolled to his feet, drawing his plasma cutter as he turned to face it. It wasn't the male thrak. The creature was smaller, a four-legged predator with sinewy muscles and eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Its dark, scaled hide blended seamlessly with the rocky terrain, making it nearly invisible. It circled him, low to the ground, its movements unervingly fluid. Elias didn't fire immediately. He studied it, noting the way it tested his defenses, feinting toward him and retreating just as quickly. It was intelligent, but it wasn't the apex predator he had been warned about. That realization did little to comfort him. If this was merely one of the planet's lesser threats, the male thrak would be something far worse. When the creature lunged again, Elias was ready. He sidestepped its attack and fired a precise shot at its flank. The plasma bolt struck true, the creature letting out a guttural screech as it collapsed. Elias didn't waste time examining his kill. The sound could attract larger predators, and he needed to keep moving. Hours turned into days as he navigated the treacherous terrain, his supplies dwindling faster than he anticipated. The storm offered little reprieve, and sleep came in fitful intervals, always with one eye open. He encountered more of the smaller predators, each encounter pushing him to the brink as he refined his tactics and learned the rhythms of the hostile ecosystem. But the male thrak remained elusive, a shadow that loomed over every moment. It wasn't until the third day that he found the remnants of the Zinter expedition. The wreckage of their equipment was scattered across a shallow ravine, the telltale signs of a struggle etched into the ground. Deep gouges carved through the rock, blood spattered across the jagged edges. Whatever had happened here, it had been swift and brutal. Elias approached cautiously, his plasma cutter raised. Among the debris, he found the remains of a Zinter scout. The alien's sleek form was crumpled, its metallic plating torn open like paper. He examined the wounds, noting the precision of the attack. The male thrak hadn't simply overpowered its prey. It had dissected it, targeting vital points with a surgeon's precision. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just a beast. It was a hunter in every sense of the word, calculating and methodical. He couldn't outmuscle it, and even outsmarting it would be a monumental challenge. As he sifted through the wreckage, he found something unexpected, a damaged Zinter data module. He powered it on, the screen flickering weakly before displaying fragments of the team's final moments. The footage was chaotic, the camera jerking wildly as the team scrambled to evade an unseen threat. And then, in one horrifying instant, the male thrak appeared. Elias paused the playback, his heart hammering in his chest. The creature was unlike anything he had imagined. Its form was massive, its scaled hide shimmering with an iridescent sheen that seemed to shift with the light. Multiple limbs extended from its torso, each tipped with razor-sharp claws, and its eyes burned with a cold, predatory intelligence. But it wasn't just its size or strength that unnerved him. It was the way it moved with a grace that belied its bulk, as though it had mastered every inch of the environment it called home. The footage ended abruptly, the camera falling to the ground as the male thrak closed in. Elias stared at the frozen frame, committing every detail of the creature to memory. He had no doubt that it was aware of him now. As night fell, he made his way to the cave he had marked earlier, his thoughts racing. The male thrak wasn't just an obstacle to overcome. It was a puzzle to solve, a living embodiment of the planet's ruthlessness. If he had any hope of surviving, he needed to understand it, to anticipate its moves before it made them. The wind howled outside as Elias set up a crude perimeter around the cave, using what little equipment he had left. He leaned against the rough stone wall, exhaustion weighing heavy on him, but his mind refused to rest. Every decision, every action he took from this point forward would determine whether he lived or died. And somewhere out in the darkness, the male thrak was waiting. Elias crouched in the shadow of a jagged boulder, his breath slow and measured, his eyes fixed on the creature stalking just beyond the clearing. The male thrak moved with deliberate precision, its massive form making no sound as it wove through the alien terrain. Even from this distance, Elias could see the subtle shifts in its iridescent hide, its scales rippling in patterns that seemed to reflect the chaotic light of the storm. It wasn't just blending into its surroundings. It was becoming them, a seamless predator in a world designed for destruction. He stayed still, every muscle in his body tense. He hadn't planned on encountering it so soon, not without more time to prepare. But the male thrak had its own agenda, and Elias suspected it had been following him for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The thought sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't the blind savagery of a beast. It was something far more dangerous. The male thrak stopped abruptly, its head tilting as though sensing his presence. Elias held his breath, his mind racing. Firing at it now would be suicide. His plasma cutter might wound it, but it wouldn't stop it, and the noise would only draw more predators. He needed another way. He reached slowly into his pack, his fingers brushing against the crude device he had cobbled together the night before. A makeshift sound emitter tuned to mimic the low-frequency calls of the smaller predators he had encountered. It was a gamble, but if the male thrak was as territorial as he suspected, The sound might divert its attention long enough for him to slip away. Elias activated the emitter and tossed it into the clearing. It landed with a soft thud, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the device emitted a low, guttural growl, a perfect mimicry of the creatures that had attacked him days before. The male thrak's head snapped toward the sound, its body coiling like a spring. It moved in a blur, faster than Elias could have imagined, pouncing on the emitter and crushing it beneath its claws. The sudden violence was almost hypnotic, the sheer force of the creature's attack a stark reminder of its power. But Elias didn't linger to watch. While the male thrak investigated its false prey, he slipped away, moving as silently as possible through the jagged terrain. Hours later, he found himself at the edge of a narrow ravine, its walls carved into sharp, unnatural angles by centuries of erosion. He descended carefully, his mind replaying the encounter in relentless detail. The male thrak's intelligence was undeniable, but it wasn't omniscient. It could be deceived, manipulated, but only if he understood it well enough to anticipate its responses. Elias spent the next several days observing the creature from a distance, cataloging its behavior with the meticulous precision of a scientist. He noted the patterns in its movements, the way it patrolled its territory with a mix of calculated efficiency and raw aggression. It wasn't a creature of chaos. It thrived on control, shaping its environment to suit its needs. But it wasn't invulnerable. Elias began to notice subtle tells. The way its movements slowed after prolonged activity, the faint hesitation when it encountered unfamiliar stimuli. It was the apex predator of Karen 4, but even it had limits. Armed with this knowledge, Elias shifted his approach. Instead of avoiding the male thrak, he began leaving small offerings in its path. Chunks of the smaller predators he had hunted, carefully arranged to avoid suspicion. The first few times, the creature ignored the offerings, its predatory instincts keeping it wary. But over time, it began to approach them more readily, its caution giving way to curiosity. Elias worked slowly, methodically, never pushing too far, always keeping a safe distance. He started incorporating elements of the male thrak's environment into his traps, mimicking the natural patterns he had observed. He learned to move like it did, to mimic its sounds, to think like it might. Each interaction brought him closer to understanding the creature, and with that understanding came an unexpected revelation. The male thrak wasn't just intelligent, it was sentient. The realization hit him one night as he watched the creature from a concealed perch, its massive form illuminated by the brief flashes of lightning. It wasn't just reacting to its environment, it was contemplating it, making decisions with a deliberation that bordered on human. Elias felt a strange mix of awe and unease. He had come to Karen for expecting to face a beast, but what he found was something far more profound. The turning point came when Elias stumbled into a narrow gorge, the walls lined with razor-sharp outcroppings. He hadn't realized it was a trap until it was too late. The male thrak appeared at the far end, its massive form blocking his escape. For a moment, panic threatened to overtake him, but he forced it down. He had spent weeks studying this creature, understanding it. Now was the time to see if that understanding meant anything. Slowly, he lowered his plasma cutter, holding his hands out in what he hoped was a universal gesture of submission. The male thrak tilted its head, its luminous eyes narrowing as it regarded him. It took a step forward, and then another, the ground trembling beneath its weight. Elias didn't move. He met its gaze, forcing himself to remain calm even as it loomed over him. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small piece of meat, holding it out in offering. The male thrak hesitated, its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent. Then, slowly, it lowered its head, snatching the offering from his hand with surprising delicacy. He let out a shaky breath as the creature stepped back, its gaze lingering on him for a moment longer before it turned and disappeared into the shadows. For the first time since arriving on Karen 4, Elias felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was connection, and it was a connection that might just save them both. The days following Elias's tentative connection with the male thrak were a delicate dance of cautious trust. He moved through Karen Ivy's hostile terrain with a renewed sense of purpose, his focus shifting from mere survival to understanding the creature that had defied every expectation. Each interaction built on the fragile foundation they had established, a careful balance of respect and curiosity. The male thrak was never far, its shimmering form a constant presence at the edges of his awareness. It didn't stalk him in the predatory sense anymore, but it watched, its luminous eyes tracking his every move. Elias felt the weight of its gaze like a challenge, urging him to prove himself worthy of its attention. He began leaving offerings more deliberately, placing them in locations where he could observe its behavior without being seen. The male thrak's intelligence continued to astonish him. It didn't simply take the offerings, it examined them, testing their weight, their texture, even their placement. It was learning about him just as he was learning about it. One night, as the storm raged outside his makeshift shelter, Elias reviewed the notes he had painstakingly recorded on his datapad. Patterns emerged in the male thrak's movements, its habits, even its preferences. It favored higher ground, positioning itself to survey its surroundings with maximum efficiency. It avoided certain areas of the terrain, places where the earth was too unstable or the vegetation too dense. It had an acute awareness of its environment, and it used that awareness to dominate it. But there was something more, something deeper. The male thrak wasn't simply surviving. It was thriving, adapting to the challenges of Karen 4 with a precision that bordered on artistry. Elias found himself wondering what the Zinner had really hoped to achieve by sending him here. Had they truly believed he would die without question, or had they suspected the truth about the creature all along? The question lingered as he ventured deeper into the male thrak's territory, his path taking him to a series of natural formations he hadn't encountered before. Towering spires of crystal jutted from the ground, their surfaces glowing faintly in the storm's flickering light. The air here was different, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It was beautiful, otherworldly, and deeply unsettling. The male thrak appeared from the shadows, its movements fluid and deliberate. This time, it didn't stop at a distance. It approached him directly, its massive form dwarfing his own as it circled him with an air of calm authority. Elias stayed still, his heart pounding as he watched its every move. The creature stopped in front of him, lowering its head to his level. For a moment, they were eye to eye, the alien intelligence in its gaze sending a shiver down his spine. Then, slowly, it nudged him with its snout, the gesture so unexpected that Elias nearly stumbled backward. He held his ground, his instincts warring with his rational mind. This wasn't an attack. It was something else. Hesitantly, he reached out, his hand hovering inches from the creature's shimmering hide. When it didn't retreat, he placed his palm against it, the scales warm and surprisingly smooth beneath his touch. The connection was electric, a surge of understanding passing between them that words could never capture. Elias didn't just see the male thrak as a predator anymore. He saw it as a kindred spirit, a survivor in a world that demanded nothing less than perfection. And in that moment, he realized something else. The male thrak wasn't alone. It led him deeper into the crystalline spires, its movements unhurried but purposeful. Elias followed, his curiosity overriding his caution. They reached a clearing where the spires formed a natural circle, their glow casting the area in an ethereal light. And there, nestled in the center, was something that took his breath away. A smaller male thrak, its form less imposing but unmistakably similar to the larger one, lay curled on the ground. Its breathing was shallow, its scales dulled and cracked in places. Elias approached cautiously, his eyes darting between the two creatures. The larger male thrak watched him intently, its body coiled with tension, but it didn't stop him. Kneeling beside the smaller one, Elias studied its injuries. It was clear that it had been attacked, the wounds fresh and jagged. He reached for his pack, pulling out the limited medical supplies he had left. The larger male thrak tensed, a low growl rumbling from its throat, but Elias held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm trying to help," he said softly, not expecting it to understand, but needing to say it anyway. He worked quickly, cleaning and dressing the wounds with a precision born of necessity. The smaller male thrax stirred weakly, its eyes flickering open to meet his. There was no malice in its gaze, only pain and fear. When he finished, he stepped back, giving the creature space. The larger male thrax moved to the smaller one's side, nuzzling it gently before turning its gaze back to Elias. For the first time, he thought he saw something in its expression that resembled gratitude. As the storm subsided, Elias retreated to the edge of the clearing, his mind racing. The male thrax wasn't just a predator, it was a protector, a caretaker. Everything he thought he knew about it had been wrong, shaped by the Zinter's narrow perspective. They had sent him here to prove humanity's worth, but now he saw the truth. The male thrax wasn't a threat to be conquered. It was a lesson to be learned, and if he could survive long enough, he intended to prove that lesson to the galaxy. Elias woke to the sharp chill of dawn on Charon 4, the storm's fury temporarily subdued. The air carried a fragile stillness, as though the planet itself was holding its breath. He rose from his makeshift camp, his muscles aching from the previous day's efforts, and turned his gaze toward the crystalline clearing where the male thrax and its injured kin had remained. He felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest, a blend of hope and responsibility that unsettled him more than the planet's unrelenting hostility. He approached cautiously, his movements slow and deliberate, careful not to disturb the fragile peace. The larger male thrax was awake, its massive form coiled protectively around the smaller one, whose breathing had steadied but remained shallow. The creature's eyes met his, an unspoken challenge lingering in their luminous depths. Elias felt the now familiar tension of being judged, measured against a standard he couldn't fully comprehend. He reached into his pack, pulling out the last of his medical supplies and a ration of water. The male thrax watched intently as he knelt beside its injured kin, its gaze like a weight pressing down on him. Elias set to work, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. He cleaned the wounds again, noting with a grim satisfaction that the infection hadn't spread. The smaller male thrax stirred weakly, a low whimper escaping its throat. The sound struck Elias like a physical blow, a stark reminder of how fragile life could be, even in a place as unyielding as this. He glanced at the larger male thrax, its body tense but unmoving, and found himself speaking without thinking. "She'll make it," he said softly, though he had no way of knowing if the creature understood his words. "She just needs time." The larger male thrax tilted its head, the gesture oddly human, as though considering his statement. It made no move to stop him as he finished his work, though its watchful presence never wavered. When he finally stepped back, Elias felt a strange sense of accomplishment, tempered by the knowledge that his resources were nearly exhausted. He spent the next hours gathering what he could from the surrounding terrain, using every scrap of knowledge he had gleaned about the planet's ecosystem. He fashioned rudimentary traps to catch smaller prey and harvested medicinal plants he recognized from the Zinter's database. Each task was a race against time, driven by the understanding that the injured male thrax's survival depended as much on his ingenuity as on its natural resilience. When he returned to the clearing, the larger male thrax was waiting. It stood at the edge of the crystalline circle, its body silhouetted against the flickering stormlight. In its stance, Elias saw something unexpected, a sense of acceptance, even trust. He held out the small bundle of supplies he had gathered, laying them on the ground as an offering. The creature approached cautiously, its movements fluid and deliberate, and inspected the items with a careful precision that once again struck him as profoundly intelligent. Days blurred together as Elias fell into a rhythm of care and observation. The smaller male thrax's condition improved steadily, its wounds healing faster than he would have thought possible. The larger one remained a constant presence, its watchful gaze never far, its behavior increasingly cooperative. It began bringing him small offerings, fragments of crystal, scraps of vegetation, even pieces of the smaller prey it hunted. Elias accepted them with quiet gratitude, recognizing the gestures for what they were, an acknowledgement of their shared purpose. The fragile equilibrium they had built was tested one night when the storm returned with a vengeance. The wind howled like a living thing, the air charged with a chaotic energy that made every breath feel like a struggle. Elias had secured the smaller male thrak in a sheltered corner of the clearing, its vulnerable form cocooned in the protective embrace of its larger kin. He worked to reinforce the crude barriers he had erected, his movements driven by sheer determination. The first sign of trouble came as a deep, resonant growl echoed through the clearing. Elias turned to see a shadow moving through the storm, its form massive and menacing. Another predator, larger than anything he had encountered before, emerged from the swirling chaos. Its eyes glowed with a predatory light, its movements slow and deliberate as it sized up the male thrak and its human companion. The larger male thrak rose to its full height, its iridescent scales flaring with vibrant colors that reflected the storm's erratic light. It let out a roar that shook the ground, a challenge as much as a warning. The predator hesitated, its own growl rising in response, but it didn't retreat. Elias felt the familiar surge of fear, his mind racing as he considered his options. He wasn't a match for this creature, not with his limited weapons and dwindling strength. But he wasn't alone anymore. The male thrak moved first, launching itself at the intruder with a ferocity that took Elias's breath away. The two titans clashed in a storm of claws and teeth, their movements a blur of violence and precision. Elias watched in awe, his instincts screaming at him to run, but he couldn't leave. Not now, not after everything. The battle was brutal and brief. The male thrak emerged victorious, its opponent retreating into the storm with a pained howl. But the victory came at a cost. The larger male thrak staggered, its body heaving with the effort of the fight, fresh wounds marring its shimmering hide. It turned to Elias, its gaze steady despite its exhaustion, and let out a low, rumbling sound that he could only interpret as acknowledgement. He stepped forward, his fear giving way to resolve, and placed a hand on its flank. "We'll get through this," he murmured, unsure if he was speaking to the creature or to himself. The storm began to subside, the air growing still once more. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Elias stood between the two male thrak, his place in their fragile alliance now undeniable. Whatever came next, he knew they would face it together. Elias stood at the edge of the crystalline clearing, the stormlight softening as the planet shifted into a rare moment of tranquility. The male thrak pair rested nearby, their massive forms entwined in a way that spoke of both protection and kinship. The smaller one, though still fragile, had regained some vitality, its scales beginning to regain their shimmer. The larger one lay beside it, its wounded body rising and falling with steady breaths, a testament to its resilience. Elias felt a sense of quiet awe watching them, reminder of how far they had come together. The datapad in his hand flickered with updates from his ongoing notes. Weeks of careful observation had transformed his understanding of the male thrak. Their intelligence, their social bonds, their ability to adapt, it all defied the cold, dismissive labels the Zinter had assigned them. He had been sent here as an expendable pawn, a means of proving humanity's limitations against an apex predator. Instead, he had discovered something far more profound, the potential for coexistence. But Karen 4 was not a forgiving world, and the alliance they had built remained precarious. Resources were dwindling, and the planet's unpredictable dangers loomed ever closer. Elias knew he couldn't stay here indefinitely, not without finding a way to signal for help. Yet the thought of leaving the male thrak behind, especially in their current state, filled him with a gnawing guilt he couldn't ignore. As the first streaks of sunlight pierced the horizon, Elias set out to scavenge more supplies, his thoughts a whirlwind of plans and uncertainties. The terrain was harsh and unrelenting, the jagged rocks and dense vegetation a constant reminder of the planet's hostility. But he moved with purpose, his growing familiarity with the environment giving him an edge he had lacked when he first arrived. His scavenging led him to a ravine he hadn't explored before, its depths hidden by a thick canopy of alien flora. Descending carefully, he discovered a series of crystalline outcroppings similar to those in the male thrak's territory. Embedded within the crystals were faintly glowing nodes, their energy resonating in a way that sparked an idea. If he could harness the energy from these nodes, he might be able to repair the damaged components of his emergency beacon. The work was painstaking, each node requiring careful extraction to avoid triggering a collapse of the fragile crystals around them. As he worked, the realization struck him that the Malethrak's territory wasn't just a random choice. It was a deliberate decision, a strategic advantage. The creatures had likely adapted to this environment not just for survival, but because of its unique properties. The crystals weren't just part of the landscape. They were a resource, a connection to the planet itself. By the time Elias returned to the clearing, the sun was high, casting shimmering reflections off the crystals that surrounded the Malethrak's resting place. The larger one rose to meet him, its gait steady despite the wounds it had sustained. It watched as Elias carefully unpacked the energy nodes, its luminous eyes tracking his every movement. The smaller one stirred weakly, its gaze briefly meeting Elias's before it closed its eyes again, seemingly reassured by his presence. Elias set to work repairing the beacon, his hands moving with a precision honed by necessity. The energy nodes pulsed faintly as he connected them to the device, their power stabilizing the damaged circuits. As he worked, the larger Malethrak drew closer, its curiosity evident. Elias couldn't help but smile at the sight. For all its formidable presence, there was something almost endearing about its inquisitiveness. When the beacon finally hummed to life, Elias felt a surge of relief tempered by a deeper, more complicated emotion. Activating it meant the possibility of rescue, of escape from this relentless planet. But it also meant the end of the fragile alliance he had built. The Zinner wouldn't see the Malethrak as he did. To them, these creatures would remain threats, obstacles to be eliminated. The beacon emitted a steady signal, its light pulsing rhythmically against the backdrop of the clearing. The Malethrak watched it with a mixture of wariness and fascination, their instincts undoubtedly sensing the significance of the device. Elias knelt beside the larger one, resting a hand on its flank. "If they come," he said quietly, "I'll make them see the truth. I won't let them take this from you." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. The Zinter were ruthless in their efficiency, their decisions driven by cold logic and ambition. Convincing them of the Malethrak's value as more than a trophy or a threat would be an uphill battle. But Elias was determined to try. He owed these creatures that much, and more. As the hours passed, the clearing grew quieter, the Malethrak settling into a wary calm. Elias remained vigilant, his thoughts a tangled web of hope and fear. When the beacon's signal finally drew a response, it came not as a rescue ship, but as a shadow on the horizon. A sleek Zinner vessel descending through the atmosphere, its metallic hull gleaming ominously in the fading light. The Malethrak stirred, their instincts flaring to life as the vessel approached. The larger one stepped in front of the smaller, its body coiled with tension. Elias placed a hand on its side, a silent gesture of reassurance. "Stay with me," he murmured. "We'll face them together." The vessel landed with a calculated precision, its engines hissing as it powered down. A hatch opened, and a squad of Zinter emerged, their sleek forms encased in the unmistakable armor of their military caste. Their leader stepped forward, his expression cold and appraising as his gaze swept over Elias and the Malethrak. "You survived," the Zinner said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Impressive." And the creature? His eyes shifted to the Malethrak, his tone laced with thinly veiled disdain. Elias straightened, meeting the Zinner's gaze with a determination that surprised even himself. "They're not what you think," he said firmly. "They're intelligent, sentient. More than that, they're worth protecting." The Zinter leader raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Is that so? Prove it." Elias turned to the Malethrak, his heart pounding. He placed his hand on the larger one's side, feeling its warmth beneath his palm. "Show them," he whispered, unsure if the creature could understand him, but hoping it would. The Malethrak met his gaze, a flicker of recognition passing between them. Then, slowly, it stepped forward, its movements deliberate and measured. The Zinner squad tensed, their weapons raised, but the creature made no aggressive move. Instead, it lowered its head, a gesture that spoke of trust and understanding. For a moment, the clearing was silent, the tension palpable. Then the Zinter leader lowered his weapon, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "there's more here than we anticipated." Elias exhaled, relief washing over him like a wave. The fight wasn't over, but it had begun. Together, they had taken the first step towards something greater, toward a future where understanding could triumph over fear.